Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know that traffic is difficult and it takes you a long time to get downtown, but we're glad that you're coming out to our event. My name is Cesar Garcia, and I'm the founding director and chief curator of the Mistake Room. And I'm very happy to have Oscar Murillo tonight for an event that I think will summarize and reflect on our first exhibition and also give you a little bit of an insight about our organization and a little bit more about why Oscar's project was really the way that we decided to launch a program that I think will really expand the cultural landscape in Los Angeles by bringing international artists to produce work here in a city that's perhaps one of the most diverse cities in the United States. The Mistake Room was founded as the only really independent nonprofit institution here to solely devoted to an international program of contemporary art. And the organization really began as a series of questions and reflections about the status of contemporary art around the world, and particularly in burgeoning cultural centers outside of the United States and Western Europe, and the relationship of these activities to diasporic peoples and places outside of their geographic confines. The Mistake Room was really artist-centric from the beginning, and tonight's conversation, and we're just going to dive in, was really about inviting an artist who could perhaps understand the context in which we were working and provide a set of complex questions that would set a tone for the kind of programming that we were going to be engaging with here in Los Angeles. And it's really a gift to have Oscar here because I think as curators, we are blessed to be able to work with many artists and we can produce exhibitions, and we're fortunate to meet creative makers in all media nowadays. But every once in a while, you're gifted an opportunity to work with an artist that really transforms your understanding, not only of art, but of really the way that art interacts with broader social, political, and cultural dynamics. And Oscar has sort of been that kind of gift. We met about 2 years ago, and it was one of those humbling experiences of walking into a studio not necessarily knowing right away how to respond to the work. It's work that's complicated. I think everybody sitting at this room today or who came to hear Oscar talk has heard or read a bit about Oscar's practice. It's a complicated practice, but at the same time, it's a practice that's expanding not only, I think, ideas of around painting, but more broadly ideas about artists' relationship to labor, to making, and making outside of just art, but making as a sort of set of issues of value and economics. I'm not gonna tell you, talk much about your practice, and we're gonna jump right in, but I just wanna say we're really grateful to have you here. And we're really honored to be able to sort of host your first institutional solo exhibition in the United States. It was sort of the perfect way for us to begin our program. And with that said, I think we're just gonna start to channel Hans Ulrich. We're gonna start at the beginning. Let's go back to 2012. I wanna talk a little bit about our first sort of encounter. At the time you were I believe just had been told you were invited to produce a show at the Rebels, and I happened to be in London on the way back home from Egypt, and somebody said that I should come to your studio. And I came in, and there was all these canvases on the floor, and there was sort of these different objects, but one of the things now, looking back, is that there wasn't much in the studio. And I want to start there, because I think the paintings, or your relationship to painting, has been at the forefront of conversations for some time now, and I'd like to be able to go back a little bit and tell us how you got to painting, what you were doing in graduate school, and everything sort of up to before you sort of started to really engage with painting.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for being here, and it's always a pleasure to come to LA. Although it's a long trip for me to come from London, but it's always great. It's a beautiful city. So I think maybe 2012, or the idea of making paintings, or not having much painting or work in the studio. Actually, there's a really great friend of mine here from London and my time at the Royal College, Neil Rock, and he was one that I had many great conversations with in London while studying, and I was never really interested in, or I guess still not so much interested in painting, or painting, or exploring painting and its history, or trying to forge a conversation in painting, move it forward. And therefore, while studying or doing my MFA in London, I was never really painting. I hardly painted, and painting kind of became this dual or parallel kind of practice that was more about how do I fill time, or filling time in while engaging in things that I felt were more profound. And when I say more profound, I'm kind of mostly speaking about engaging with my environment, or not just a physical environment, but also people, and what that geography means, demographic means, socially, and slightly political by default. And so those were the things that I was doing. It wasn't really until 2012, maybe somewhere in that year, I happened to be in New York, and I said, well, this is the time where I'm just going to paint or develop the idea of what painting could be within my understanding of that medium. And I was really, and even now, I'm really more interested in drawing and making drawing quite literally a fixed mark on a material that gives you more permanence. And obviously, that material could be canvas, and I kind of decided to use canvas. And so that's kind of how a consciousness of painting began to infiltrate my practice, or my broader practice as an artist.
You mentioned drawing. There's drawings in the exhibition, and I want to go a little bit into the process of how you work. We were so fortunate enough to have you work here on site, and we've had conversations, so I understand the process. But I think most people see the painting stretched or hanging as banners or taking on these multiple forms, and it seems like the mark making and gesture work and the particularities of colors and tones are sort of very specific and intentional, and there's such an element of improvisational and impulse in the beginning parts of the work. I'm going to sort of summarize a little bit, and hopefully I will do justice to the process, but a lot of the physically intensive sort of part of the work happens in the early stages when you were starting to work here, and there was this, when you moved in here, you asked us for sort of the keys, and you sort of a lot of canvas and paint, and then we came in 2, 3, 4 days later, and there was, the spaces were sort of transformed, but then there's a gradual slowing down, and then eventually the paintings sort of start coming together. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about as I've been writing for our upcoming publication, but can you talk a little bit about when you decide a painting is finished? The paintings sort of are put together from different pieces of canvas that sort of sit and permeate in the studio, and then you go in and you intervene, and the mark making happens on them, but there comes a moment where it becomes a painting. How does that determination happen? How do you know when a painting is finished?
Yeah, it's working. I think, yeah, I'm gonna hold it like this. No, let's just use this one. Like you said, I think drawing is definitely a beginning of things, or infiltrating, as I said, the idea of maybe going into painting, and painting kind of happens, once you stretch something and it kind of, everything kind of reveals itself, and it's very confrontational. But for me, it's always, I feel very guilty about painting. I almost feel like I shouldn't be painting, or the word painting, or my own kind of background as an individual, and thinking about painting. And also living in Europe, living in London, there's this kind of, going to the Royal College in a painting course, there was always this kind of very indulgent idea, and Neil, who's sitting here, knows this very well. You sit down for days and talk about the history of painting, and also painting in Europe is very romantic. And so I found this very tough, because people say, well, yeah, but you're romantic too, and perhaps I am. But I kind of, maybe being confronted with this romanticism, found it very difficult. And so I kind of began just being this kind of automatic, almost mind-to-hand delivery of almost release of energy, like, going to jog, like at the end of a tough day, just release, and that happens very much continuously, without even thinking about painting or even thinking about a finite work, but just kind of doing something until I'm physically exhausted, and hence that's where the idea of labor starts to infiltrate my practice. From that moment, and I kind of pile up an index of material, and I begin to have some people, I was at Carl Arts a couple of days ago, and as soon as I mentioned aesthetics and painting, some people walked out of the room, and I guess that's understandably, but literally after having processed a lot of material through an automatic making process, you really, most of what happens thereafter is a quasi-intuitive arrangements that has a lot to do with aesthetics and my own kind of response to color, texture, and that's where the paintings begin to formulate, and all the things that are to do with my own relationships in regards to, like I said at the beginning, demographics, social definitions also infiltrate the work.
A lot of the canvases are sort of put together, and if you haven't seen the show here, I really do urge you to actually spend some time with the exhibition, but also spend some time looking. And I think it's something, it sounds so funny to tell somebody to look, but when you realize that most people spend an average of less than 5 seconds with a work of art these days, and half of that is usually with a phone in their hand, it's pretty interesting, our relationship to visuality and looking. And the paintings are quite complex, and you'll notice that they're made up of a series of patches of different pieces of canvas. And some of the tones that form the foundations of the canvases are from pieces that have been sort of harvesting the debris and the detritus from Oscar's studio or different places of work for several years, that are then sort of travel with him and sort of are combined with new material that is sort of processed on sites in which he works. But there's a really interesting relationship to this idea in which the paintings become indexical, speaking from the material perspective. I remember in the first sort of David Hammond's retrospective at PS1, there's an essay in that book on the ideology of dirt and the importance of the idea of the debris or the detritus to a practice that is more socially conscious or minded. Can you tell us a little bit about using this sort of debris? We've talked about it before, and I like to think about it as harvesting, because this, as seeing sort of Oscar work, the canvases are on the floor and they're sort of picked up, and there's almost this intuitive feeling. I get reminded of when my mother picks up vegetables in the store and knows exactly how to do it. I still fail terribly in doing that. But there is a sort of sense of impulse that attracts certain of the pieces, or that in terms of how they enter. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the importance of having the painting sort of impregnated with this debris and almost begin to tell their own sort of history or their own story in a very material way? Why the dirt? I mean, the first thing you did here was sweep up the space with the canvas.
I think maybe to answer the question, or begin to answer the question, it isn't so much about like dressing up a canvas with dirt or debris or a kind of the unwanted, but I think going back to this idea of not being a painter or not wanting to be a painter and feeling uncomfortable with painting and the history of painting, and and understanding or having an awareness of how painting, as I began to, as you grow up as a student and you begin to see how painting functions or how an artist paints. And there's this very kind of detached engagement, with the brush usually. And I'm not saying that every painting is made with a brush. And so there kind of becomes this bridge, almost like wearing new shoes. The first month or 2 months, you're very precious about your shoes, and you only wear those new shoes to a certain engagement because they're your best shoes. And maybe the third month you're slightly less precious. And so kind of that's my relationship to canvas. That is important that for this canvas to go through a process of being unprecious and being kind of almost stripping away the history of what a canvas has been for our millennia. And then while that canvas has gone through almost this humiliation and kind of beaten up, and there are obviously other things that are important here, but only when that has happened do I then feel comfortable to engage with that material. And on top of that, also I'm interested in how this canvas registers the space and takes the space, and therefore, hence your first visit to my studio, there wasn't seemingly many things, but there was really an array and a spectrum of material that had been harvesting, as you rightly said, for a number of years on the floor, without also any kind of hierarchy. Usually you go to a studio or storage, and the canvases, if they don't show the props, I like to remove all these kind of hierarchies of treatment, and I think this is the beginning of how I begin to engage with the material in the studio, and that's kind of my entry point into then feeling very comfortable to let go of any pretenses and then feeling slightly more kind of comfortable in attacking not just the painting but the canvas and the material.
You talk about this process of sort of putting the canvas through these sort of process of acquiring sort of being impregnated with this to try this in the studio and sort of not approaching the canvas in this pristine way. And then earlier you mentioned that you felt sort of guilty about painting, which I think is a really interesting way to describe your relationship to the medium, because it really brings me to think about your relationship to beauty, because you have this, you sort of seem to be very, I think, particular about how you approach materials and what painting is supposed to look like, and you have this, you feel or you think that painting can perhaps be indulgent. Do you think of your paintings as beautiful? And is that the approach when making them? Is that important? Are the aesthetic qualities of the paintings important?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to use the word beauty, but I mean the aesthetic qualities as I see them and as I project them onto the work. Of course, they're important. They obviously, whether there's the rate of satisfaction or the rate of coming to the I've been in LA for a couple of days now, and I hadn't been here, so this is the first time I've seen the show after we put it together in January, and I felt good about being here again. But it's there is the rate of satisfaction towards one particular painting changes and increases or decreases. Again, the idea of beauty, I'm not sure if that's the if that's how I would engage with the work. I think it's mostly about making certain aesthetic judgments and treating each individual canvas or painting as I'm going through that, working with that painting, very individually. I haven't got a set agenda, or there isn't a kind of nothing is uniformed. Every kind of painting is very individual, and the path is very different, and it's never really the same. And I think the parameters in which I made those decisions are based on certain, I could say, intuitive, aesthetic decisions that are to do with very basic things like color, mark making, texture, and the temperament of the surface. And that's where I think those are the key factors when I come to complete a piece of work.
The paintings in this exhibition are sort of around the perimeter of the room, and there's a dynamic installation component that, while at the same time I think hints at process, is also sort of made up of objects that retain particular sculptural qualities that hint at functionality. And the paintings usually appear in these environments. And you've at the South London Gallery show, it was really your first institutional show. It was sort of an all-immersive installation, and it was really was the first time you brought in all of these different aspects of the practice, from the event-based situations that you often stage, to the objects, into the room. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of the installations. It's rare, I've seen the paintings alone, but usually the way you engage with painting seems that the installations frame the paintings in many ways. And there's a constant conversation between the installation and the paintings. Can you talk a little bit about that and how important the installation components and the sculptural works that have become such a part of the visual language of your practice, how important that is to the paintings?
I think perhaps it's the opposite. I don't think the installation frame the paintings. I think that the paintings kind of offer a kind of finished or offer an end. I think if you look around, there's all these kind of objects that are in limbo or have been used or are kind of or kind of assume the idea of being in production, or I can pick up a bottle top and do something to it. So the paintings are kind of at the stream of that notion of movement, or being in limbo, or in between spaces. And so, it's interesting because, as you said, 2012, or let's be a bit, more flexible and go back to 2011. And I was still a student, and I was studying, and I kind of hadn't really had the break. And my break only really came last year when I had the opportunity to do a show that was reflective of my interest as an artist and my practice. And so before then, painting is a very easy thing in terms of movement. Painting, I could, since I'm so not precious about, I can really take any of these paintings here, unstretch it, fold it up, and send it to London or send it to anywhere really in the world. And I'm interested in the idea of movement and kind of trade and commerce, I think. And so for me it was really easy to fold a painting and send it to New York, or fold a painting and bring it to LA, and vice versa. And so there was kind of an automatic infiltration of these paintings, and perhaps a lot of people really managed to see my work through painting first. The South London Gallery show, or even going back maybe a couple of months, a show at Carroll, which is a young gallery in London, was really my first opportunity to canvas, to really open up a practice that I had been kind of developing in my head and in the studio, and show a width of possibilities, and not really with the end of wanting to make a finished product, but to really offer a kind of an investigation of ideas. then that was followed by South London Galleries in September last year in London, where the space was very ambitious and the possibility of diving into that was slightly more profound. And therefore I say that painting within the scope of my practice is really where you could say that, or a branch of that kind of investigation ends. And so I don't think the paintings have the capability to frame my practice. They offer a reduction of interest, but not necessarily frame an entire possibility.
When we started talking about a project, we didn't have a space yet. I sort of had an idea about what to be in a space, and was sort of on a world tour at the time, visiting artists and thinking about the viability of something like this. And I remember having lunch with you after, and I said, I want to open a space, I want you to be the opening show, and you said, great, let's do it. So the conversations have sort of really happened over 2 years, which is a very long time, and so you've sort of seen the organization come together, you went through the process of selecting the space, and when we found it, I mean, the reason the space sort of still exists like this is because you wanted to use the space as such. And you're probably going to be the only artist to use the space as such in this particular sort of context. Oscar show closed on Saturday, and then we have an architectural renovation, but when you saw the space, you wanted to use it like this, and I want to know why. You had been to LA and you had done some research, and you knew a little bit about the context in which you were, but why the idea of using the site or engaging with a particular site in this way?
I think there's a number of things or a number of reasons why. I like to be very, economical, and I guess this goes back to the idea of learning that the best way to infiltrate anything is if you can. So, like, I don't want to make this too long, but the whole thing began when I was a student and not having a lot of space, and so I kind of learned that if you just not stretch your paintings or you fold their work, suddenly you have more room to make work and more room to work, and that kind of the idea of economy, is somehow the foundations of my entire practice. The idea of being economical, and so doing or thinking about doing a show at the Mistake Room, and we can talk about the idea of why distribution center and the surroundings of this site and what it means to be here in downtown LA, surrounded by warehouses and businesses of production. That's kind of one reason, but the real reason was really that I wanted to work towards making my own microsystem, a microsystem where everything had its own autonomy, and it wasn't really dependent on anything, and that microsystem was able to sustain itself regardless of where it found itself. And so the support system really needs to be a space. It doesn't have to be a polished space or a kind of, or the notion of the perfect white cube, as we know historically, since the early, somewhere in the 20th century. And so it was just really about having a site that offered shelter for a microsystem, and that was really the important thing.
The way that you approached the production of the work, when you came in here, there was materials in the raw state that were brought into the space, and pretty much, it really was in the state that we found it. I mean, there was like no cleaning. I believe you didn't even let us get a clean. I mean, it really was in a very raw state. And when you came in here, you had, I think, particular ideas that you wanted to sort of put through, or materials that you wanted to put through certain processes of production, and you enlisted and hired some individuals to help you while you were working here. And I think it can become very easy, considering the context of the site, to think about the installation as sort of site-specific. And I don't know if you necessarily would characterize the specificity of the site, or is this an exhibition that can sort of exist anywhere? Or how tight is it? You know, how much does the space really influence what the materials that you ended up working on here ended up becoming?
Yeah, I mean, it's site specific to a degree of maybe. I mean, it's going to be a hard word to use, but maybe in regards to maybe design or how best to use a space. And that obviously happens with any space. When you move to a new apartment, you move to a new house, you go in and you say, how can I best use a space to live or to move around, to encounter things, to change people's perceptions as they move around. And so that was really that's as size specific as this exhibition gets. And it will be really interesting to see how this show, if it travels or if it goes somewhere else, to see how that might, how it might assist. But I really, when I first moved in here and brought in all the canvases and used this space mostly as a studio, it was really about making sure that I was comfortable here working. And then at a certain time, then you start thinking, okay, this needs to be an exhibition where obviously it's going to be seen and lived not just by me but by other people. Then those are the other considerations that then come into play. So that's where a notion of size specific comes into, almost like curating, I guess, because there are all these objects in this space that have to be related to each other. But yeah, that's kind of where the size specific element comes into.
There's videos on the wall, and unfortunately we don't have the sound because clearly it would interfere with our conversation. But the videos, usually, we're here at a factory site. As you can see, you have a day unfolding sort of in a candy factory in Colombia, a candy factory that you have a personal sort of relationship to in many ways, and that is going to be such a central part of, I think, the next chapter of this investigation, because as you prepare, Oscar's preparing for an exhibition, his first New York exhibition at David Zorner in 2 weeks, which I think continues sort of some of these interests and labor in, I would even say in a more explicit way, in the other exhibitions. But can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the decision that you wanted to show these videos in this way? Every time that I've seen sort of your video or moving image-based work, it exists on an IMAX screen or sort of isolated in a projection. I've seen you install it over a sheet. How important are the videos to the overall practice, or do they just serve as contextual imagery that you like to have in conversation, with the paintings and the installations?
Yeah, the first time I mean I've been working with video for some time, but I find it really hard to show the video. I usually, I guess you can say people draw or write. I like to take a lot of videos, and I have an archive of video that I like to pull and go through every time I'm thinking about doing a show. And so in this particular situation, or the first time, going back to the show at Carroll in Chicago last year, I didn't want a press release, and so I decided to show a video, and the video was the video in the factory, and it was shown, as Cesar said, it was shown in an iMac. I guess there were different reasons why, and one of those was everybody here, hopefully is familiar with computers, and you get a lot of information through that kind of a relationship. A video and a projection is kind of rare somehow, and it's very exhibitionist like it is here. And so my relationship to this particular video has a duality, and kind of it's personal because it's a place where my grandparents worked, and my mother worked, and friends of mine and family members do still work. And so, and it was very problematic because I am aware of the relationship of, I guess, the idea of the factory in relationship to the history of art. And you know, you can go back to a kind of Warholian idea, or you can even go back to the Renaissance and talk about the artist and his or her studio that mimics the idea of maybe factory in our kind of day and age. And so, you know, I had problems, but I thought, well, let's go for it and let's, you know, open up this conversation about the production side. And so when I found myself in this factory 2 years ago, again, because you know I've been going to this place since I was a kid, technology had infiltrated the making process, and it wasn't as physical as it was. And so I found myself more than wanting to kind of explore physicality, I found myself looking really, or just observing through the camera, this very seductive, almost you get sucked into this movement of change, you know, almost like alchemy. How, you know, glucose becomes, you know, a candy, and there are these different stages, and so in a way that kind of mimicked my own making of work in the studio. And so I kind of, in that show at Carlos' Chicago, this video became a kind of, almost a prophecy of how I work, or how I could work as an artist in the studio. In this context, it becomes a window, or it animates this idea of the distribution center as a site of production. Again, not so much in a Warholian way, but really in a more kind of material sense, and how material gets manipulated, and how material can change from one's form to another, and that's really the reason why I decided to project the idea of manipulating a form, and subsequently you can see it in these other videos, and really that was the thinking behind having these videos in the show.
Intrinsically, I think a lot of the ideas stemming, or that really sort of went into the foundation of this project, in many ways are to an extent related to your own biography. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that at the end of the day, that's a particular, I want to know what part, how important that is to generate the context around the work. The movement of not just commodities and materials, or the ideas of alchemy and materiality, but the idea of bodies, and movement of bodies. And I don't necessarily know if I would characterize the making process performative, or, I think we're sitting here in a platform that was used to work in the middle of a group of people. So I think that there are these sort of dimensions that hint at this sort of relationship to the body, through labor, through the making. These ideas of migration, how important are they to your work, and particularly from a very personal way, how much does your own biography inform the work, and at what point does that sort of influence end, and where does the work sort of begin to have a broader conversation, than just around the biography of the artist?
Well, before I go or dive into that question, which is very important, you say, on Sunday, I was coming from Sao Paulo to LA, and I took a direct flight on a Korean airline, and I kind of, and it was a 12-hour flight, and so Sao Paulo is on the stream, stream west of South America, and to get to Colombia it takes 5 hours. Just to kind of, Colombia is on the north, and so it comes north through, touches through Colombia, goes up Panama, and then it begins to go through Central America into the United States. And so 5 hours into the flight, we were just beginning to touch Colombia, and so the bottom of Colombia, you have the equator, which divides the world in half. Okay, and so I happened to be in this Korean flight, and there was a bit of turbulence, and so the air hostesses, starts talking in Korean for us, obviously, and so, I mean, this is so kind of romantic, but I think it's important. And so I look down, and we actually are going through the place very close to where I grew up in Colombia, and then then I kind of react, and I'm like, I'm in this Korean flight. So the whole thing was just really this kind of coming together of cultures, coming together of what somehow the world is today. This kind of amalgamation of cultures. And migrations, whether they might be economic, social migration, whatever they might be, but everybody moves around now. A certain type of people move around now, and so I guess now coming back to myself, I started moving around since I was 10, and there was a huge cultural shock. Moving from Colombia, a tiny little village, to London, and not really speaking a word of the language, being English, and so that's where the whole thing kind of begins, and so I did a show at the Southern Gallery called "If I Was to Draw a Line, This Journey Started 400 kilometers north of the equator," which is very much where I find myself moving from that place to London, but also being aware that the equator is a place that could be found, that 400 kilometers north is anywhere either in Colombia or somewhere in Africa or Asia. So I also wanted to leave that open to this idea that almost the equator represents what the world, this kind of no longer top-heavy relationship that culture and commerce once had with the world, is no longer the Americas or the North America of 20, 30 years ago, or the European cultural influence. The idea that Africa and Asia and South America somehow are, equal players of the world economies now is interesting. And so the show really became an index and a kind of personal, my own personal belief and understanding of how the world is changing. And that's really how a lot of the work that I, the shows that I kind of have been doing, I'm trying to kind of understand, what that means, and what it means to, to work in different environments. I just, a couple of hours ago, I just got back from Mexico, and having a relationship with people that can collaborate with me there, and how that might change my work. So things for me is important to have them open-ended all the time. That there's no closure, and migration is at the heart of that. Simply because there's nothing is fixed, and I'm always more than this idea of chance. I think it's important that things are flexible. Flexibility is important, and I guess I'm interested about taking this platform and having it in my studio in London, and how that can manifest as a body of work, in a year's time or in 2 years' time. So this for me is kind of an important thing.
The role of collaborators and the role, I guess, of the active bodies or the implicit bodies in a lot of the making of your work, I think is one of the last things I'm going to ask you before we open it up to a few questions. Because you do work with collaborators all the time, and you use the social event, like you use the birthday party or you use these sort of staged social events to bring these different groups of people together. But it's always sort of been done as a sort of performative engagement. And in the next exhibition that you're going to be doing, bodies become and labor becomes much more activated as an idea through bodies that are collaborating on site. So I don't want you to give too much away, but I do want you to talk a little bit about that decision and what's going to happen in 2 weeks. And, because it's really a big push forward in how you've been engaging in terms of presenting an exhibition proper. And if you can just give us a little bit of preview of what's coming, and then we'll open it up to a few questions.
I mean, a lot of these kind of events, I'd rather they not be staged. I'd rather there be a sense of reality. So, I guess here in the context of the show, I happened to be working here for 20 days, and it was my daughter's birthday. So, I said, why don't you guys come over? I bring my family over, and we celebrate her birthday here. And kind of that was the perfect vehicle, and obviously a coincidence, but it was a perfect vehicle to kind of have an engagement with a wider group of people, collectors, trustees, or just the general public that happened to be here at the opening, and have this kind of interwoven relationship and social stratas, etc., etc. And I guess it's weird to talk about the internet because it kind of hardly have anything to do with a relationship to my practice, or it doesn't really manifest itself in my practice, especially not here. But one of the things I remember growing up was the internet was one of the only tools that allowed me to have a kind of constant communication with people in my place of birth in Colombia, and so it was really about bringing a couple of factors together: the internet, social media, the factory where I grew up, which kind of over a period of time in the last maybe 2 years has become important, and my own place as an artist in the world, and how I can best somehow try, even for myself, try to shift perception and perspectives. And so this next show in New York is really about using myself as a catalyst, or all these factors of the factory and of people that I know and I have relationships with, beyond them as workers and beyond them as people who work in the factory, as catalysts for a conversation about how can information infiltrate through social media, and also the factory as a maker of chocolate or candy or marshmallow can be the kind of anchoring factor or thing to diversify in very democratic means, and bring awareness to what it means to, or what I like, or what I kind of, how I see the world, to an audience in New York that is incredibly self-centered. And so the show is really about that, and it isn't so much about the factory or the candy, but it's really almost like dropping the bomb and trying to, through the lure of chocolate.
Can you tell us what the show will be?
So the show is called a mercantile relationship to trade or commercial, a mercantile novel. And it's really using, as I said, using my relationship to this factory that not just me, but members of my family have had for maybe over 80 years, and working with these individuals to set up a production line of marshmallows covered in chocolate in this gallery space in New York. And so from the beginning, the production line is very much authentic and to the point of having like climate control and cleanliness and etc. etc. But the factory line is not open up. It isn't about having people in it and for it to be this kind of voyeuristic experience, but it really is about almost bringing into the center of a place that is so removed to notions of manufacturing and production, like it is, maybe Chelsea, New York, or just Manhattan as a place, and use that as a catalyst for people to engage in social media. So the idea is that in order for you to participate with the candies or whatever, you have to be active on a social media channel that we are setting up, and that's really the kind of structures of the exhibition.
And the individuals that are coming from Colombia are living in New York for the first time?
Yeah, so everybody in the show have never been to New York. It's their kind of first experience of New York. So also in it is this idea of the American, like them living the American dream for 2 months and feeding. So the idea of social media is that they automatically and democratically feed to us what it is to live the American dream. And so there's a very, it's a faceted show. And I'm sure there's more aspects to it, but I can't remember. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of the idea of the exhibition.
We're gonna open it up to some questions. Are there questions?
You talked about the anxiety of the work and also that there is no end to the work. Do you feel like after you finish painting a particular canvas that it continues to inform the rest of your work in that particular breadth of work or in that particular collection that you're putting together?
Sorry. So you're saying if a painting can potentially be used to describe a width of the practice?
When you finish a painting, does it continue to speak to the rest of your work? Like, is there a dialogue between something that you finish painting and something that you're about to paint?
I mean, if we were to just simply talk about painting within my practice and not anything else, absolutely. I mean, I think even in this room and looking at the groups of paintings, I feel I can confidently say that they are kind of very different from each other. But and also it was really healthy to come in today after such a long time, and I've done some paintings since doing this body of work. It is to me useful, and I think that there is a continuum in feeding back and forth information. Simply because it isn't so much about wanting to, it isn't so much about what is the next, what is the next body of work, but it's like everything is in process. Everything is in process, and anything and everything can inform a next potential painting. So even if I was to go back, even if I was to say, some people might say, the paintings that you did 2011 were not successful, but I could still get influenced by them. And I'm sure I'm not the only artist. I'm sure artists or painters. I was in London and I went to see this George Basilist show, and he did a body of paintings in relationship to an earlier body of work. So I think it's important that there is a kind of continuous, at least for me anyway, a continuous feed, and I continue looking back in order to continue to move forward, maybe.
Any other questions?
Yeah. You talked about how it took you a while to get training and how you kind of resisted getting into it for many different reasons. And now you're also talking about your future projects and the involvement of the factory workers in Colombia and all of this. I'm wondering if for you is painting like a vessel for some projects you have for a certain period of time, and is it something that you're going to continue doing, or is it something that is temporary a viable option, but something you're just considering for the moment?
I mean, painting? No, I mean, it wasn't really painting, it was drawing, and through drawing I go into painting, or like art making into painting. But no, I think no, painting is, I'm not sure, it is, you know, I talked about this idea of infiltration and how painting can infiltrate much faster into, I guess, society, you know. And I could honestly say that painting has been a catalyst for, I guess, allowing me or giving me kind of space to do things that I feel are more profound than just having a kind of indulgent engagement in a studio. I don't see it as a I'm just trying to find the right word. I'm doing it is almost as my own kind of selfish endeavor, you know, as an artist, but I feel like I have a responsibility, you know, whether that self, I'm kind of giving myself that responsibility that my practice is far more important than being in the studio making a painting. But I guess just for myself, you know, I will continue to do it, almost like a hobby, you know, like I like to get in the studio to make these things. So you will always be there, as long as I can entertain it. But the responsibility of doing this kind of more ambitious projects is something that for now I have to do it. It would have been really easy to do an easier kind of show in New York, but I felt all the kind of factors were there to really push and try and push this experiment. You know, so I haven't done this before, and so until literally last week, when the people that are coming from Colombia they got the visas, it could have easily been a different kind of show. Imagine having a factory of non-workers, just people who couldn't get a visa. I mean, that would have been interesting for me too. You know, it opens up a whole different kind of conversation about migration or politics or, you know, border control or whatever. And I would have been ready to have that conversation too. But yeah, painting is really this kind of, almost becomes the spine, you know, and it's consistent, meaning that it's always there. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious about you, in response to the last question that Cesar asked, when you're talking about the Colombian workers kind of documenting their reaction to the American dream. So I'm just curious, I guess since you went from Colombia to London, do you have any kind of preconceptions about what your idea of the American dream is? And
well, no, I've never lived in America, and in London there isn't an American dream. There isn't a dream in London, actually. You know, London
People don't dream in London.
That's why I still live there, because there's, you know, London is very real. There's no fantasy. So, yeah, no, I think, actually, you know, the first time I came to America, or like New York, was in 2012. It was my first time. You know, before that I would go to Miami to go to Colombia, but I never, and I spent 6 months in New York. And, you know, I was just a kind of, I was still like finishing school, and, you know, it was great it was kind of the best way to experience New York. I wasn't a tourist, I was there to study for a short amount of time. And so I kind of soon saw New York as this, you know, very self-centered place, and one that I like to engage with in very little doses. And yeah, so I didn't have this kind of dream-like, and I don't think most people that live in New York do. I mean, I think, you know, it's a very tough place to live. So I'm trying to also give this group of people, it will never be the same, because, you know, we have to find an accommodation, etc., etc. But I'm trying to give them as much of a realistic experience of what it might be like. So they're not going to live in Manhattan, for example. they have to commute from Brooklyn and take an hour train into the city. Give them as much as possible realistic idea of what it could be to live in a place like New York.
Any more? We'll have time, I think, for one more question. Any other question? No? I heard yes or no? Okay, well, I think we're gonna wrap up. I just wanna, again, thank you, Oscar. It's been a real gift to work with you, and I'm so happy we were able to open up our program with this project that's really been 2 years in the making. Oscar show closes on Saturday, and we will go dark for a little bit here on the site as our architect Alfonso Medina, who's with us tonight, gets to work on the renovation of our building. I hope you'll stay up to date with the events if you sign up on our mailing list in the front. We're going to be staging some off-site events during the time of the build-out, and we'll reopen in mid-July with a solo show by a Thai artist, Curator, Arun Namchai, his first one in Los Angeles, and that will open the second week of July. So I hope that you'll be able to join us to celebrate Alfonso's incredible project for us, and also Crit's first exhibition. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, Oscar.